Wow. It's preparing to stream. We're nearly there. Come on, little internet, do your job. There we are. Okay, I think, let me just double check that I can see myself on the. Yeah, this is slightly longer than usual, which is worrying me, but yeah, let's see. Okay, right, we are now live. So yeah, I think this is time to start. So we've got lots of people in the room. We're also streaming on YouTube at the same time. Thank you everyone for being here. So good evening or good morning, for Brian and for some of you, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Lots of you have already started telling us on the chat where you are. The chat should be fully functional at the moment. So yeah, please let us know. It's always nice to see, the international fantasy community getting together. So I'm Dimitra Femi. I'm professor in fantasy and children's literature and co-director of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic here at the University of Glasgow. And we're here today to celebrate two books, one by my co-director, Professor Matthew Sangster, and one by Professor Brian Attebery, who's been working very closely with us at the Centre for a number of years now. Both books are key interventions in fantasy criticism and theory, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion to follow. So I will introduce our speakers in proper detail in a minute, but let me tell you a little bit first about the Centre, because this is the beginning of the semester, which means it's our birthday. We are 3 years old. So the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic was founded in September 2020, and that, of course, came after over 5 years of earlier fantasy-related activities here at Glasgow. So we were aiming to conduct and disseminate world-reading research in fantasy and the fantastic, to educate and support the diverse cohort of scholars working on fantasy at postgraduate, PhD and postdoctoral level, and to bring actually together also academia and the wider fantasy community in order to understand fantasy's transformative intellectual, cultural and social potential. And actually the two books that our two authors will be talking about today are also contributing very much to this debate. So I'm sure many of you will know us already, but for those of you that are attending one of our events for the first time, you'll probably know our Fantasy Masters, GIFCON, our annual conference, and a book series that the three of us actually on this screen are co-editing, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So let me just introduce our speakers now. So tonight we're very, it's a brilliant opportunity to have two important people in fantasy scholarship. So Brian Attebery, first of all, is Emeritus Professor of English and Philosophy in Idaho State University. He won the World Fantasy Award for his editing of the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts, and has been honored by both the Science Fiction Research Association and the Association for the Fantastic in the Arts for his scholarly work. During his time as Leverhulme Visiting Professor of Fantasy here at Glasgow, he helped launch the Perspectives on Fantasy book series. I said I'd say more about that, from Bloomsbury Academic Press, which he edits alongside myself and Matthew Sangster, who's right here with us. His Mythopoeic Scholarship Award for Fantasy, How It Works, which is a book from last summer, 2022, is his third book, following previous, and third award, actually, not just, it's not his third book at all, what am I saying? It's his third award, following previous awards for Strategies for Fantasy and Stories About Stories, Fantasy and the Remaking of Myth in 92 and 2013, respectively. And Brian, although retired at the moment and an emeritus professor, is very much still writing and contributing. And he just told me about two articles that he's been working on that are coming out next year. One on affordances of fantasy is going to be published in the journal Genre, and one on Frankenstein and the Science of Dreaming in Science Fiction Studies. So welcome, Brian. And a second speaker, and this is my co-director, Matthew Sangster. Matthew Sangster is Professor of Romantic Studies, Fantasy and Cultural History, and co-director of the Centre with me. His books include the monograph Living as an Author in the Romantic Period, two collections co-edited with John Mee, Institutions of Literature, 1700-1900, and Remediating the 1820s, and the one we're here all for, An Introduction to Fantasy, which has just been published by Cambridge University Press. He's currently collaborating on 2 AHRC-funded projects exploring reading history using neglected historical borrowing records, libraries, reading communities, and cultural formation in the 18th century Atlantic, and Books and Borrowing 1750-1830, an analysis of Scottish borrowers' registers. He's also external curator on the British Library exhibition, Fantasy, Realms of Imagination, which opens at the end of this month. And he's co-edited the exhibition's companion volume, Realms of Imagination, Essays from the Wide Worlds of Fantasy, with Tanya Kirk. So yeah, great to have you both here. So just a quick word for housekeeping. Brian and Matt will start their sort of dialogue at this point, but please feel free to post questions via the Q&A box as we go. And then we'll see how we'll manage to incorporate as many of those as we can in the event today. If you are tweeting or sharing on social media, the hashtag is Framing Fantasy. So yeah, without further ado, this is time for me to sort of bow away and give the floor to Brian and Matthew. Looking forward to this. Welcome both.
Thanks very much, Dimitra. Just to say, we're open to how we do questions. If you have questions while we're talking, type them into the Q&A and I will try and pick those out and we can incorporate them into our initial conversation. But if you would prefer to ask questions about things that we are not speaking about, do also start adding to those to the Q&A if you would like to, and we'll have a sort of more formal Q&A session towards the end. How are we going to start, Brian? Is it worth just starting with why we wrote these books? What are ideas for? Why did you want to write this particular book on fantasy?
I think I'll start by saying something about your book, because I am more fresh on it, having just reread it, and you'll have to remind me what I wrote in my own. But I wanted to say that although this is called An Introduction to Fantasy, it's not Fantasy 101. It's a really sophisticated and interesting theory of fantasy. So maybe Fantasy 1101 or whatever the graduate seminar number instead for introducing. So I have lots of things to say about that book, and I'll let you kind of take the lead on asking about mine.
Well, shall we start with, because I remember you were writing the sort of the essays that would sort of come together, or the sections that would come together in Fantasy Outworks when you were with us in Glasgow as Yvonne visiting professor in 2019. So I guess, do you want to talk a little bit about what came before those in terms of the composition of this book, and then how it got to the point where its lovely Charles Vess cover was appearing on shelves in 2022?
Yeah, the book happened because of my time in Glasgow and giving the series of talks there, and I realized that those fit together with some other public events that I'd been involved in previously, and I was thinking about the genre of the talk or the lecture, and inspired by some of the great sort of talks like Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, or some of Ursula Le Guin's wonderful sort of speech essays, and thinking that's a really nice model for talking about literary topics without being quite so boring and formulaic. So part of what I wanted to take advantage of was the format of the talk, where you interact, where you get to tell stories, where you are physically present, so you can't pretend you're not a person thinking things through and making mistakes and all of the things that we do as people. So I like being able to use that format as a basis for an academic book that is not just your ordinary sort of academic book, which I've never been particularly good at anyway, writing something with a central thesis and a set of proofs and so on. If
sure
you've if you've looked at my book, and I noticed that Matt, you did a little bit of this too. All of the claims come at the end, after the kind of rambling and conversation and narration that went on beforehand. That is really how those claims come about. So I corralled those all in a final chapter, and had kind of fun doing that. But I was also thinking about what's my role as a scholar of fantasy literature, which is just a weird thing to be anyway. And I realized I remembered something that I had thought through many years ago, which is using Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist's notion of thick description as a model for what I'm doing, where you start with some detail and you trace connections outward in all directions, ultimately to come up with a formulated hypothesis about patterns of significance and systems of symbols. And so that's really the method I've used here and basically throughout my career. It's not systematic except after the fact. It doesn't assume any one philosophical stance, not even those continental ones that we all bow to. And it gives you the chance to tell stories, not even the chance, the obligation to tell the stories of how it came about, and to acknowledge your own perspective, to be entertaining, which Clifford Geertz is a wonderfully entertaining writer, and to be clear, and to shake up habits and formulas of academic writing. So that's the gist of what I was trying to do.
No, I think you have picked up on the fact that I read your book sort of just when I was finishing mine, and I did read the conclusion and think, hang on, should I have a conclusion after these chapters to sort of sum things up? And that works really well in Brian's book. Maybe I will just steal that idea. So that was the last. I think I submitted it to the press for the clearance reading without that conclusion, but knowing that I might want to include. And then wrote, that was the very last thing I wrote, just to try and bring things together. And I think it. I mean, I'm always quite pleased when books have a short conclusion, sum things up. It feels like a generous thing to do when people have limited time and might want to refer back to things. And so it can serve as a sort of index for the whole book and remind you where claims and things are. I think that's one of the really nice things about the end of your book. You can look at I think you're right to say that the journey of getting there is the important thing in many ways, but it also serves as a lovely sort of expanded table of contents. So once you've read the book, you can go through those propositions and go, okay, yes, that's where it is. It's about 2/3 of the way through that chapter. The thing that I remember I wanted to return to particularly at this time was I was remembering I took a recommendation of yours that you gave to our colleague at Glasgow, Taylor Driggers, about reading Laurie Marks recently, and I've been loving those elemental logic books. And I was remembering that I had read about them before I read them in I think your third chapter, and so it's very, very useful to think about what the context was in that third chapter at the end, and then to find it with the index. It's a very navigable book, which I think is something nice. And to have when you're designing a book, like a structure that helps people through rather than sort of blocking them.
Yeah, would you like to describe the genesis of your book?
I guess the first time I ever taught in universities, I was teaching this course broadly on the fantasy, although it started with Beowulf and spent a long time getting to Tolkien and Harry Potter through the Gothic and through the Tempest and through various other things. So I taught this sort of long history of fantasy course, and I did a lot of reading around fantasy at that point, including strategies of fantasy. It's the first time I read your work, Brian. So it was sort of bubbling under as a thing that I was doing, but then it was really coming to Glasgow that sort of gave me the chance to do fantasy again, right? Because my first job at Glasgow was lecturing 18th century literature and material culture. But when I was being interviewed, I mentioned that I had seen that the department had this fantasy program. I was very keen to be involved. What I didn't know is that Rob had just taught the first year of the fantasy program with 7 people on it, and the second year of the fantasy program had expanded to 23 people. And so they were not quite sure who was going to help Rob, and probably therefore quite pleased that someone turned up who was prepared to volunteer and do that. And then I had that experience of teaching our second cohort of fantasy students with Rob, the Phoenixes. And I guess the book comes partly out of that experience of teaching and then subsequent experiences of teaching, in that Rob had a wonderful set of courses running from 18th century ballads through William Morris. We made everyone read The Fool Well at the World's End initially. That has subsequently been voted off the programme as too much for a week. I think understandably so. We teach shorter Morris now, but running right through to very contemporary fantasies. But it seemed like that core course discussing primarily works of literature, people wanted to talk about TV and film adaptations and other works. And people also wanted to talk about fan cultures and communities. So the course that I wrote to teach in my second year at Glasgow, called Fantasy Across Media, and was partly about fantasy in forms of film and comics and TV and games, and partly about the communities around fantasies and their practices, so fan fiction and performance, prize culture, and these sorts of things. And I've always really loved teaching that course. I think it's on its 6th or 7th run at the moment. I'm very much enjoying working with our students at the moment. So in finding research around that, it was interesting to me that some of that research was a little bit less connected with the mainstream scholarship in fantasy literature, as David Butler's wonderful book on fantasy film, for example, that's sort of known but seems to be doing something slightly to one side. So in writing an introduction, I wanted to integrate some of that scholarship and some of that thinking about fantasy in other media a little bit more. I guess another question that was raised by Rob's course and by your own work on fantasy is mode is where we start with fantasy. And because my training is in romanticism, which features a lot of works which contain fantastic elements, even if they're not straightforwardly fantasy, I wanted to think a little bit more about that longer lineage that connects to fantasy. It is a difficult question, I think, whether Beowulf is a fantasy or not, because then you're really in the difficult state of trying to recreate the mindset of the people originally reading it from a particular set of evidence, whether they in that sort of state where they know the events described to be unreal, but are prepared to treat them as if they're real. But I think we still need to think about Beowulf in the context of fantasy, because people steal from it all the time, and because people now thinking about Beowulf would probably read it through fantasy as one of their primary lenses. So part of what I wanted to do is think about how that process that you map as mode, genre, and formula applies or might apply historically. And then I also wanted to think a little bit more about fantasy communities, sort of how, I think one of the things that I've always enjoyed about fantasy is how generous it is as a form. It seems to be a form that welcomes people in. Like at the beginning of my final chapter, I quote this wonderful interview with Amal El-Motar about how she read The Hobbit and then she knew how to be a writer. It told her everything that she needed to know about how to start telling a story and what was exciting in a story. I think quite a lot of us have had that experience of reading a fantasy and saying, oh, okay, that's how those things fit together. Or, oh, you can do that with words. I can now see a whole realm of possibilities I'd not seen before. And so I wanted to get that sense as well as fantasy as a sort of a kind of form that was open in a way, perhaps that genre in general is open, but perhaps I think fantasy is the strongest articulation of that openness, of the idea that we're part of a larger tradition from which we can take things to do new things with, but also change those things, return them to the I think Terry Woodling borrows from Tolkien the lovely soup of story metaphor, which is a good way of talking about that. It's a tradition that we can all take things away from and return things to, in which we can all sort of iteratively make into a new thing that speaks the things that we would want it to speak in the present without losing the other things that it said in the past. Sorry, that was an incredibly long ramble, but those were the sort of the three main things I wanted to do. It did come a lot out of discussions with students, discussions with your work, with the work of people like Farah Mendelssohn. I revisited Catherine Hume's book, which I really admired, about fantasy and mimesis. I was reading Helen Young and Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, those books about race and representation. So it seemed like there was a lot of stuff I really wanted to be in conversation with. This was really an excuse to do that as much as anything else.
Did Cambridge approach you, or did you approach them with the idea of this?
I went to Cambridge. I did originally go to Oxford and pitch for the very short introduction to fantasy, which they said had been assigned to someone else, but it's still not, as far as I've seen, appeared. I was lucky that they turned me down, because I am not a particularly good writer over short spans. I think I would really struggle to write a very short introduction. I pitched this to Cambridge at 70,000 words. I contracted at 90,000 words, and the actual book is 110,000 words. So they were kindly willing to give me that much leeway. But I went to them partly because of their existing interest in fantasy from publishing things like the Cambridge Companion, partly because I worked with them on the book on institutions, and that worked very well. And they come talk to me about saying they were interested in developing a fantasy list. And partly because I thought they would have the ability to do something I was very, very keen to do, which was to make the book £20. So the proposal was, I would like to write an introductory book on fantasy, but I would like a book that is affordable by students and fans. So if we are going to sign this contract, can you please make sure that it comes out in paperback at the same time at that cost? And because of I tried for that broader pitch, and I made the argument that it would be sort of broadly readable. Whether I fully succeeded in that is another question. It's always a very difficult thing to judge before the book's out. You've actually had a chance to talk with people who've read it, but they were prepared to accept that was a good idea for a book that they wanted to have available. So, and then yeah, they sent it out to readers. They contracted it, and then I tried to write it quickly. This was my sort of dream. Having my first book had taken a very long time to write alongside a series of other things. So I thought I will try and write this in 2 years. And I wouldn't have been able to do it if I'd not been having all these conversations before, but it was a close run thing, but it just about got there.
Yeah, as I read through the book, I realized this could be a very short conversation, because we basically don't disagree about much of anything. But we do take different routes into fantasy, different approaches. And one of yours that I particularly liked is talking about fantasy not as genre or even mode, but as an assemblage. And I had some thoughts about that and questions about it. Maybe you could explain that, and also we can get into a little bit about what that implies.
I mean, again, I think some of this comes from your work on the fuzzy set, which I still think is one of the most useful ways of thinking about fantasy, that like there are things that are central to fantasy, but saying that things are fantasy or not fantasy is usually not all that helpful. And thinking about the degrees with which they relate to fantasy is more useful. I guess, it goes back partly to that about community, that I think you don't just want a sort of series of texts as being fantasy. It's also a series of practices, a series of ways of using language, so a series of cultural structures and traditions, and it's the people who invest in it. So I think when you talk about a fantasy community, that's a very real thing. So the people who read fantasy, who write about fantasy, create fan fiction, go to cons and those sorts of things. I don't want to see like them as being solely an audience for fantasy. I want to see them as being stakeholders and parts and intimately connected with those sorts of with sort of the making and the fantasy and being fantastic. And that was something I think is implicit in quite a lot of scholarship about fantasy, but I wanted to really sort of think about in this book. In the end, that it's one of the things that I tried to think through. The last chapter is the thing thinks about that most, and that took me down some directions I had not anticipated. I had not thought about writing guides. But I do think when fantasy writers talk about fantasy, they talk about it quite differently from the way that people who are more self-consciously literary writers talk about their own work. That's often about a special process that happens only to me, the literary writer, creating my great works. This is slightly stereotyped, but I think whereas when fantasy writers talk about their work, it's often about, I had these conversations with people and I looked at other writers and I thought about how they did it. Or the practices like Neil Gaiman publishing the scripts for The Sandman because Alan Moore had given him scripts and he'd found that really useful and he was thinking about how to produce comics. Or Jeff Vandermeer's wonderful Wonder Book about processes of writing fantasy with all the other writers, including that. Or I'd forgotten about and was delighted to return to Gene Wool's very weird book, Castle of the Otter, which is the sort of effectively the director's commentary on writing the Book of the New Sun, but is wonderful and puckish, and I think lets him be funnier than he can often be in lots of his works. There's a lovely sense of his delight in literature, but also his grumpiness and his playfulness that comes through that book. And I think that's that sort of sense of the writers as being in community and conversation with their audiences and trying to help those audiences become writers and become creators in the field. Is there even in Tolkien, in that letter to Milton Waldman, where he says, I'm going to tell some of the stories fully, but I'm going to deliberately leave gaps because I'm not a very good composer, I'm not a very good artist, I want other people to stick those things in there. So that sort of sense that fantasy is connected with all sorts of other forms. I guess that connects to one of the things I was noticing in your book when I was reading it through again this time, that there's this really strong thread about fairy tales running through, which I remember being in some of your other works, but seemed to be particularly prominent in this one. So the fairy tale as sort of a kind of root form for fantasy, but also like a key form for thinking about what fantasy does, a sort of a good way of articulating about how it works. And I wonder whether you could talk a little bit more about fairy tales and how important they are to you in your conception of what fantasy does.
Yeah, I've always thought of fairy tales as the kind of master trope of fantasy because of what not even so much Tolkien as George MacDonald has to say about fairy stories in The Fantastic Imagination, his short essay that kind of packs everything in. And the usefulness of fairy tale studies like Vladimir Propp, although with all of these kind of structural approaches like Propp's morphology, you have to remember that it's based on a pretty small corpus of tales, just the Russian tales in one collection. And so when he says they all have the same structure, yeah, because he's kind of limited it that way. And there's a wild, variety of fairy tales that don't quite fit that, but it's a good place to start. And I think that the key thing for me about fairy tales is that they've never been invested with belief. And so there's a kind of freedom of the imagination, unlike legends, which whether you tell them as a true story or whether you say, well, some people believe this, but I don't, they always have some kind of belief language attached to them. And even more so for sacred myths, creation myths, and so on. Obviously, those are also part of the core background of all fantasy. And Tolkien was trying to write a mythology for England, for instance. But I like, as I say, the kind of freedom, the irresponsibility of fairy tales to tell a story that doesn't claim to be true and yet can discover all kinds of things that are true along the way. And that goes for everything from the traditional tales to the literary fairy tales of the German Romantics, or L. Frank Baum's attempt, as he said, to write an American fairy tale free of heartache and terror, and then he threw in all the fear and grief that we know is there in the Oz books. And Hans Christian Andersen, as a kind of inventor of traditional-like fairy tales that nevertheless express something pretty personal, pretty profound about his own kind of condition in the world. I see that operating in most contemporary fantasy. So it just seems like of all of the kind of traditional oral genres, it's a place to start, and it's not where you end up because they all are relevant. Does that answer the question?
That makes really good sense. And I think that sort of sense is fantasy. Fantasy is a sort of tale we're told that we know to contain elements that are not like looking at the interviews that are going to be featured in the British Library exhibition, and that seems to be the common thread across all of them, that fantasy, you get to make up lies to tell truths, is in effect what a couple of the different writers there say. And I think also the thing that you're talking about in your first chapter, where you're thinking about how fantasy is structurally true.
There's one other thing about fairy tales as opposed to say ballads or epics, is that the performer of the fairy tale in traditional oral cultures has a great deal of individual artistic freedom. And my two best examples of that, the folklorist Linda Degg worked with a lot of fairy tale narrators in Hungary back in the 1930s and 40s. But there was one particular narrator, Mrs. Susanna Palko, who seems to have been just a real master of the form, who was very aware of what she was doing, could incorporate bits of one tale into another if needed, could adapt to her audience. And then, I'm not going to think of his name, but one of the American tale tellers from the Appalachian tradition told a lot of the Jack tales, and somebody in the chat will come up with his name. But he also was an artist, and there's the freedom to be that kind of a creative artist within folk oral tradition for the tale particularly, and that probably feeds over into the written tale.
I think that's definitely the case. I think like fantasy is a form that's obsessed with talking about telling stories, and one of your earlier books is called Stories About Stories, and I think that sort of sense that fantasy is about about telling a particular story, but is also about the process of telling stories, the love of metafictional framings of various kinds that would be sort of considered cleverly postmodern in other forms, but are really like sort of essential to the way that fantasy is. It's a story with recognizable elements, but also a story in which the storyteller is able and sometimes obliged to change and redevelop and rework those elements. So there's a sense that it's being told to people who already have some familiarity with what's going on, but it's also been told to take them to a different place than they've gone to before, even if they've started off on the path previously.
Yeah, and I think what you were saying about the assemblages and the audience, that carries over from folk tradition as well, where the audience basically already knew the story, but they were interested to see how it was going to happen this time with this teller, and that then there's a kind of apprenticeship where you become you move from being a passive bearer of those traditions who knows the story to becoming sometimes an active performer of those same materials. And that's exactly what happens in fan communities, where somebody like, whether they're kind of organized fan communities or just people at home appreciating and saying, hey, I could do that. So you've got somebody like Edward Eager, the great American fantasist, basically writing a set of fan fictions about E. Nesbit's work, and yet creating his own very distinctive form of fantasy.
Yeah, I end up quoting a lot from N.K. Jemisin's blog in my book. Feeling slightly guilty because I feel like I should quote more of her brilliant work, but she writes so wonderfully about that process of coming up with things, about how she makes Naderhof out of a kind of a version of a particular anime stereotype effectively, but then begins thinking through the larger implications of that particular dark brooding outsider figure and trying to make him or them, as she moves later in the trilogy, into a less typical version of that, often like figure of brooding masculinity, and her sort of like her discussions about starting as a fan writer and about trying out the second person narration in fan fiction first. I think that sort of that general fan fiction tendency that like once you've created a fantasy once you've dwelt in a fantasy world, you often want more of it, or you want it to be slightly different. And I think those tendencies in fan fiction to expand, to fill in the gaps, but also to correct in certain ways, to bring out the elements of queer desire that perhaps only hinted at in the work, or to think about how you might interject. Think about Renaud McCormack's work on Tolkien interjecting working class and female presences into a world which Tolkien gives mainly the aristocratic view. I think that, I mean, to me, that's what fan fiction operates in a slightly different cultural sphere, perhaps, than published fantasy, because of the gift economy thing, and because the nature of the writing means that there are certain kinds of world building you don't need to do because it's already been done. But I think the impulse is not dissimilar in any way from the sort of impulse for writing fantasy more generally.
That's part of what I was trying to get at in one of my chapters, where I came up with the mitochondrial theory of literature, in which the thing that you incorporate from somebody else is not a dead thing that just sits there. It's a living organism that continues to function the way it was, even though it's now part of your cells and your organism. And some works seem to do that better than others. And I think maybe a lot of fantasy invites that kind of participation in a way that works of art that seem closed and final do not. So Tolkien invites response. Ursula Le Guin invites a response. We were chatting before this event. Matt and I were exchanging some ideas, and I was struck by his mention of Harold Bloom and the kind of theory of the anxiety of influence and the isolated, towering masterpiece that Bloom seems to believe in, and how different that is from what we're talking about in fantasy. Matt, you want to say something about that?
I didn't think I was going to spend, this was one of the interesting processes of writing this book and trying to write it quickly. It went, I mean, I'm never all that good about if I know exactly where I'm going when I'm writing something, I will find the writing very difficult. I will find it slightly boring to go to the set destination. So I usually have a sense of the kind of shape of the things I want to discuss in the chapter, but it then fills up with other things that I've been reading and thinking about. And so in the plan I sent to Cambridge University Press, there was no real mention of Harold Bloom. But the sort of arguments that I have with his notion of a literary canon in the 6th chapter appeared like partly because I'd been reading Bloom for something else. I'd recommended him to a doctoral student, to someone they might want to argue against. And then I realized I wanted to have that argument myself. I appreciate Harold Bloom's love of the books that he loves and the way that he writes about them, but I don't like the way that effectively it's quite like T.S. Eliot's model of the canon, where they sort of appear like obelisks floating in space. Once a work reaches canonical sentences, it will become a new obelisk floating in space and will modify the alignment of the other obelisks. But it's sort of cut off from a world in which most people would have access to those works except to gaze up and admire them. And I think that's, for me, is the problem with Bloom's model of canonicity, that he says the canonical works are for you to read, basically for you to read alone. They're books that work for yourself and for strangers, whereas I definitely with the fantasy canon, although I think also the literary canon more broadly, I would see as the works that are most useful for us to have conversations with. They're the works that facilitate us saying things we could not otherwise say, and are saying when we perpetuate those works, even if we also end up transforming them in various ways. Bloom writes at one point in his big book on the canon about reading Paradise Lost and trying to forget everything he knows about it, and it turns into a science fiction or a fantasy novel for him. And I think that's an interesting observation that Bloom could have gone a little bit further with, to think about some of the problems with his theory, although perhaps by that time in his writing he was more set in his ideas, and that would have been a difficult unpicking. But I do think that that's in the canon is always like a sort of a problematic idea, because it's about, I mean, it's in some ways I think we can apply your fuzzy set again to the fantasy canon to think about works that have been centrally useful to fantasy writers without saying that those are the only important works, and to then think what Farah Mendelssohn did a wonderful experiment in thinking about Mervyn Peake with your fuzzy set idea. She thought, what happens if the center of the fuzzy set is Peake? What does that pull around? What does that pull in around him as being more centrally fantastic? And I think it does odd things to Dickens and odd things to certain kinds of weird fiction, pulling them a little bit closer to the center. It probably also de-emphasizes magic as opposed to a feeling of strangeness, or to perhaps the more landscape-based elements of fantasy or the place-based elements, although those are there in Tolkien too, of course. So, and it's a problem we deal with the fantasy program sort of all the time. Like, how do we select a representative set of works, or an interesting set of works, or a deliberately unrepresentative set of works to fit into 10 weeks of a talk course? I can turn that question around on you, I guess. What for you are the things that sit centrally for fantasy for you? What would you find it difficult to conceive of fantasy being without?
I have two different responses to that. One has to do with a kind of historical view of things, where I want to bring out, people should go back and reread Hope Mirrlees, or a century earlier, Jean Ingelow, E. Nesbit, Kipling, and so on. And even those things from my youth that are receding into history from the 1980s, 70s, and 80s. There are a lot of wonderful books that don't get talked about. So those are my first impulse is to kind of push those at students and say we should hold them up in our critical writing, and everybody should know them. But then my opposite impulse is to look at the present and say, do those really matter to everybody? What are people likely to be engaged in today? And then kind of use that to look back to see what's important that led up to those things. And if you start from there, you might end up with a canon that's based around somebody like Nnedi Okorafor or N.K. Jemisin, and say, what leads to those, and what clusters around them, and what will they lead to, and what can we do with them? And I think for many of our students, anything that's more than 10 years old is kind of weirdly old-fashioned, and why should I invest my time in it? That's not all of them. Some of them become just wonderful little antiquarians and rediscover some of the fantasy traditions that I like. But I don't think that's what everybody has to do. And I think that our job as critics, as teachers, as scholars, is to be open to both of those perspectives, one of which says what matters right now, and then what do we need to know to get to that, and then the other is what are the great things that I should have read along the way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good description. It reminded me that sort of I've got a student who I think will be really interested in your mitochondrial chapter, because one of the things that he's working with is this idea from the John Klutz argument in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy about something which he calls maggots, which are sort of moments of fossilized ideology that fantasy writers unthinkingly repeat. And I think the argument he's going to develop is that a lot of while that definitely happens, and the obvious example would be the perpetration of certain kinds of medievalist assumptions, or in some fantasies has been quite aware of that from very early stage. So people like Le Guin is very deliberately writing a sort of a fantasy that almost seems to be a deliberate response to Middle Earth, single continent, with its primarily white-coded populace, with her dark-skinned islanders, in Earthsea, and Delaney rewrites Sword and Sorcery in the Nevian books in a very sort of similar way. I wonder whether we might use that to bridge into the first of this questions, where someone is rightly holding, sort of saying that my description of fantasy as open, perhaps is downplaying the gatekeeping that kept fantasy very white and Eurocentric until recently. I've got some thoughts on that, but I don't know whether you have something you want to bring to that. I think the first thing is we should cop to that yes, there is a definitely way that dominant strands of fantasy, particularly post-Tolkien, have emerged in a white medievalist paradigm. I guess my answer in some ways would be that if you look further back, then fantasy or fantastic stories have often been points of cultural interchange, and not necessarily always successful cultural interchange, but the points where cultures have talked to each other. So like, so the sort of the kind of collection of the, although also transformation of the Arabian Nights when it's translated into French and then into English, becomes a not unproblematic way of those stories reaching Western audiences, but they are the stories that are hugely popular in the 18th century. And similarly, often I think fantasy stories are particularly good at crossing cultures, although often transformed. You might think of the way that probably if you were looking at the sort of the works, British works that are most well known around the world, I'm pretty sure Alice in Wonderland is right up there, despite the fact it's a very weird and very idiosyncratic work in some ways, because we grok onto some of the fantastic elements. I don't know, I do have a bit more to say about this, but I'll pass it over to you and then come back to this.
Yeah, that gatekeeping happens to some extent in our memories. So that there were always non-white, non-European, non-Eurocentric fantasies around. And in this country, for instance, some of the stories by Charles Chestnut in the 19th century. But that they don't get counted as fantasy, because obviously these are just, superstitious people who believed what they were writing, which is my take on the term magical realism, which doesn't give people the sort of benefit of the doubt of doing what they do consciously, deliberately, playfully, and so on, which is part of what we ask from fantasy. But then also just simply forgetting those stories, leaving them out of the picture. So even something like a very white European writer, Lucy Boston, wrote some fantasies with non-white characters, with immigrants, with a slave in some of her Green No books, and that's part of that Oxford tradition that isn't talked about as much in the, for instance, in the Maria Sachko-Cecir's book, which I think is a very provoking and interesting book, but leaves out some of the story.
Yeah, I guess to sort of come back in, I think this is something that's really being sort of addressed far more explicitly in scholarship on fantasy than has been previously in Maria Sachko-Cecir's book, in Ebony Elizabeth Thomas's The Dark Fantastic, in Helen Young's Race and Popular Fantasy Literature, and her new book on global, a written book on global medievalism. So I think in some ways this shows the sort of way that the fantasy tradition can move around, and those processes are uncovering and recentering older fantastic works that deal with other kinds of identity. And I guess that's a good reason to have that sort of scholarly version, or sort of scholars looking at fantasy and being its cultural memory in certain ways, is to be able to find and restore some of these works to positions of interest. And this, I think, is also going on in the field. I talk a bit at the end of my book about the big controversy around race fail in 2009, which Helen Young also discusses very eloquently in her work. But I think that has actually changed a lot of what's getting published through quite like explicit institutional mechanisms, like the Tor Novellas program, deliberately centering the kinds of people who would not necessarily be seen stereotypically as fantasy creators, and deliberately downplaying medievalist fantasies and looking for fantasies inspired by other cultures. And I think you can see this in the stories that have been winning awards and lots of the series that have been published and commissioned more recently. And so I think there are certain ways in which fantasy scholarship can provide useful precursors to the field by looking at older works, but also in some ways we should be following the field in that respect. And I do agree with Brian's point that it's an editing process we need to be careful with. In romantic studies, Clifford Siskin has this notion of the great forgetting, which forgets the fact that many of the popular writers of the late 18th and early 19th century were women, and it's processes of institutionalization by universities and schools and other institutions whose boards are all male that begin to write the importance of these figures out of the picture. So it's a process of gatekeeping that goes on in institutional forms when canons get formed. And that's why I think this more open notion of the fantasy canon as a tradition in which we should encourage the broadest range of participants and inclusions as we can is a helpful pushback against some of those canonizing logics which have shaped literary studies and other forms of studies as well. I think that fantasy, for example, has some interesting things to help in film studies push back against the more early versions of film. Films have a lot of stakeholders, and fantasies, I think, also have a lot of stakeholders. But a lot of our ways of writing still credit the one authorial figure, not thinking about editors and influences or other people feeding in. One of the lovely things I've been seeing more and more in recent fantasy books is quite long acknowledgement sections talking about the writing groups that people are part of and expressing gratitude to publishers and agents and things. I think that's a really lovely way of surfacing how any book is really the work of many hands. I think we could do with thinking more along those lines.
And one of the most useful studies of that kind of process is Diana Pavlak-Gleyer's book about the Inklings, which I go back to. I think she came up with some really useful ways to look at the kinds of interactions that go on in writing groups in communities. And again, it goes against that Harold Bloom kind of pugilistic version of what a writer is, me against the world, or no, me as part of a community.
I think that's definitely the case. We've got a few questions in the Q&A, but do add questions if you would like to. It'd probably be good for us to pivot more towards questions in a moment. While people are thinking whether there are questions they would like to ask, can I ask a sort of a slightly more personal question about your book? And what were the things that you most enjoyed writing about in it? What were the sort of the works that you revisited and thought, I'd forgotten how good this is? It's just a great joy to have the chance to speak about it.
Well, I enjoyed all of the ones I wrote about. Otherwise, I wouldn't.
Yeah, I'm similar. There's a lot of books, so I would just write about the ones that I really like.
Somebody could go through and look at who I left out, because sometimes those were very deliberate choices, but I won't explain which ones. Partly it's a matter of I don't feel like I'm the best person to write about this because I don't enjoy it as much as other people do. And so I won't have the insights. So that's one of the things I acknowledge in there, and that's why I don't write much about horror fiction, for instance. I'm just not as good at it, at reading it, at thinking about it.
I do like your chapter on horror fiction where you very explicitly say that
exactly.
I don't enjoy it, but where you still have really interesting things to say about how it plays out, particularly in fantastic contexts.
But people haven't noticed that can be turned around, and I'm implicitly saying, if you don't like fantasy, maybe you're not very good at talking about it either. I didn't say that outright, but that should be implied in what I said. So the things the things I really did enjoy writing about. The first thing is that I always make myself take a second guess when I'm thinking about, I need an example for this. What's the first one that comes to mind as the obvious example? Is that really the one I want to look at, or should I take a little more time and look for the second or the third one that comes to mind because it hasn't been discussed as much? And so I do try to do that. every time I need an example. I could do Tolkien, I could do Le Guin, I could do, in more modern terms, J.K. Rowling or Jemison, but lots of people are writing about this. And so maybe I can find somebody else. And you mentioned Laurie Marks. I think a wonderful writer of fantasy from her first Crawford winning book, what is it, Dancing Jack, to her Elemental Logic series, or Karen Lord, I think, is another one that you can just go back and find all sorts of delights in, and she doesn't get talked about as much. Or I liked writing about Patricia McKillop, not because she hasn't been talked about, but because people haven't really probed what makes her stuff so different and so interesting when it looks superficially like other works. It never is.
Yes, I agree. We should still do that in the McKillop conference at some point. That's definitely a lot more to say about, although I really like your discussion of the Bards of Bone Plain in this book. I talk a little bit about Alphabet of Thorn in my book, although not as long as I would have liked. And it's encouraging to hear that you're sort of doing similar things, like both thinking what would I really like to write about and what would be the best example, but also the sort of a broader range of examples as well. This was something that we were very keen to do with the fantasy exhibition. We didn't want it to be like 6 great fantasy writers and some other people. We were very deliberately trying to get as many people in as possible. And while I think in my book I probably do write perhaps a little bit more about Tolkien and Le Guin than I should, partly because I've not had the chance to write about them before, and they were both like really formative writers for me. So they are where my mind goes back to. I had some of the most fun writing about very recent books. I really enjoyed writing about Adrian Tchaikovsky's Elder Race, which I think is a great story. I've recently met someone who's writing a book about Guy Gavriel Kay, and I'm really looking forward to that. But I think I enjoyed writing about Guy Gavriel Kay because I think he's a very accomplished and interesting writer, and he writes fantasies in a very particular way. And I wanted to highlight that. There are a couple of books I was writing about where I just want more fantasy people to read them. So I wrote about The Master and Margarita partly to give myself the excuse to reread, partly because I think it is a great book on language, and partly just because I wanted it to be in this book so more people would read it and think about it in a fantasy context. I also enjoyed thinking about some just stuff that I had been reading and watching while I was writing this book. So I got very into, at one point in the early 2022, watching the speedrunners try and break Elden Ring and thinking about how the world accommodated them in various ways and how the design of the game had watched people trying to break earlier FromSoft games and thought, actually, people really love it when they can teleport forward suddenly to a place that feels like a lot later in the game than they should be. Let's build that into the design. I was really enjoying Arcane at the time, the Netflix series based on League of Legends. So I was enjoying writing about that as well. Also, I'm very glad I put a position statement at the beginning of the book saying this is very deliberately an introduction to fantasy, not the introduction to fantasy. I'm coming from a particular place with particular things, because I think even me now would write this book in quite different ways. I would have written about the Elemental Logic series if I had read it before I finished the book. I really loved reading C.S.E. Cooney's Death's Daughter recently. That would have definitely worked its way. I'm adoring the Netflix One Piece series at the moment. So, but hey, I mean, that's the point is not with a book to try and close off all the options. It's supposed to open up conversations. And on that note, I see we've got the Q&A filling up. Dimitri, do you want to come back and referee the questions for us? Because we're not doing.
Sure. There's lots and lots of questions, and yeah, I can see that this is getting complicated now, which is good. Okay, so there was a question about the representations of disability by an anonymous attendee. So he or she is asking, why do they think that fantasy has gone from a grim tales tendency to have a greater actually frequency of disabled depictions to instead shifting to almost exclusively presenting able-bodied and minded characters? So, is the fairy tale? Yeah, that's an interesting question, I suppose, theoretically as well. We read the fairy tales as sort of representing disabled characters, and it seems like, according to this attendee, that we've lost that tendency. Yeah, I wonder what your your answer would be to that?
I think there are sort of, I mean, there are pretty prominent disabled characters of various kinds in fantasy. The one who often gets brought up when people write on this for essays for us is Tyrion Lannister. The question of, I mean, I guess it's one of those like complex questions about echoes of tradition, because there is this sort of older troping of sort of a disabled body reflecting a sort of character with propensities to evil, all those sorts of things. And I think that does still come up at various points in fantasy. But I also do think that there are a lot of very carefully written characters, sort of disabled or non-neurotypical characters in fantasy. I'm trying to remember the name of the book I was reading. It's The Unbroken has a character who has one of the central characters who's lame, and I think that's written very well. It also has a very sort of diverse cast in terms of race and neurotypicality. So I think this is something where I would see. I wonder whether it goes back to some of what was Brian saying, that those characters are perhaps there in earlier fantasies but have suffered from this canonical editing process. So maybe part of this is recovering those characters. And I think that's probably particularly true of neurotypicality. I had a student coming to talk to me about early dissertation ideas yesterday who was talking about the fairy trope of the changeling possibly being a way of framing neurotypicality. And that had not occurred to me before. That's a brilliant idea, but I don't want to do any more with, because I hope the student will. But I think you could probably look into older fantasies for ways in which the truths about disabled and non-neurotypical experience are reflected. And also I think it's one of those things that, like representations of race and culture, is changing as fantasy writers engage with that more explicitly as something they want to do for their projects of representation, and thinking what fantasy can be. If you could make the world be any way, why make it have the same exclusions as our world? Why not try and think a place where things can be different?
It may also depend on which bookshelves you go to, because I'm thinking the young adult fantasy shelves have a lot of non-normative kind of characters, whether they're neuroatypical or physically challenged in some way, or belong to a group that is excluded. So something like Rivers Solomon's The Deep, I would see as a representation of a kind of very positive way of looking at a disabled character.
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking also of Six of Crows. I was thinking of an amazing student essay on reading Coraline as a neurodivergent character, which again had never occurred to me, but it worked absolutely brilliantly. Okay, so I'm trying to sort of go through them here. So there's some more practical questions, and I think I'll leave those towards the end. There's a question about the subtitle of this talk, which I think is an important one. The subtitle of this talk referred to the affordances of fantasy, says Amanda. I'm curious about what you find to be the implications of the concept of genre when we think about it as something that can have affordances. So maybe elucidate a bit the term here and how you understand it.
Brian, I think I learned that term from you, so do you want to kick off?
Well, I actually have the first page of the article that's going to be coming out, and maybe I can read the first paragraph of that. What are the affordances of fantasy? What are the particular features of the genre that afford its use as entertainment, expression, self-examination, and cultural critique? And how do those features enable such use? That question builds in a lot of assumptions about genres and the possible usefulness of literature. To speak of affordances is to assume we are looking at a tool or a potential tool, and that there are tasks to be performed by that tool. Affordance theory thus treats texts and genres as forms of technology, and borrows from James Gibson, who coined the term, the idea that an object's affordances depend not only on its form and structure, but also on the user's needs and perceptions. So that's what I wrote about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's one of the things that fantasy can, I mean, because you get you get the sort of the wild, all art is quite useless thing. And I think that's, but once you read more of that term, it's clear that Wilde does think art does things for us, just not necessarily sort of things that can be turned into sort of Gradgrindian rules or processes. So I think affordances does have that looseness to it. And there's also not thinking of works as things that we sort of look at and experience and then go away from unchanged. So I think thinking of artworks as things that change us and things that we can use to explain those changes is one of the advantages there. One of the things I was quite surprised to find in Bloom was he's very much against the idea that art makes us better people. He doesn't, and I think we should treat that idea with a certain amount of suspicion, but I also think that's one of the more sort of utopian dreams in fantasy. By thinking the world differently, we can think the world better, and we can bring back some of that thinking into our world. So I think for me, one of the most important affordances of fantasy is to think that there are other ways of doing things, and that maybe those are worse ways we should avoid, but maybe also better ways that we should incorporate. And I would also refer back to some of the stuff we've been discussing previously, but I think fantasy is one of the affordances of fantasy is to make readers into writers, more fully so perhaps than a lot of other genres or forms of culture, or to make modders into coders, or players into creators, or any of those other kinds of personality, and to sort of generally level the barrier between like the person who makes and the person who experiences. I think fantasy is really good at making you feel like a collaborator in telling the story. I think that's something really important and empowering that it can do for its readers.
I was just rereading one of Ursula Le Guin's essays about fantasy and the monsters and the critics, where she talks about how fantasy challenges basically all of realistic fiction and its assumption that this is the entire universe, this small community of human beings doing things within a kind of socioeconomic limitations. That fantasy says, no, that's just a tiny slice of what could be, which kind of goes along with what you were saying, Matt.
Great. There's one more question that I think is also sort of going back to questions about definitions, etc. That's from Shaima. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Shaima. And they're asking how that you discussed fanfic and fantasy in other media. So they'd like to know this. What do you think about mythology retelling books like Rick Riordan's books, the Percy Jackson ones, or even most? I'll open that up a bit more. You know, what about more straightforward retellings like Circe, Madeline Miller's book, or Song of Achilles? How, there is the genre of the retelling, which is its own thing in some ways, but they're also fantasy narratives, aren't they? How do we navigate that?
Well, we could have Dimitra answer that and talk about Celtic traditions and so on. But Matt, you've got a whole chapter about that. Do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's my least favorite chapter in the book, I think, although I think it does some good things. But I think it's, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think whether or not myths were perceived as having the affordances of fantasy in their original cultures. I mean, I think there is a point where something no longer is fully and straightforwardly believed, where that sort of sense that it might not be literally true, but it might nevertheless usefully be metaphorically true comes into play. You can quibble about when that occurs, but definitely I think a lot of mythic retellings are using the patterns of fantasy and are working like fantasy texts are working, so using similar kinds of processes. So in my section on myth and legend, I focus on the Persephone myth and talk about Aeneas Mitchell's Hades Town, which might not be conventionally considered a straightforwardly fantasy, although I know that there are a couple of fantasy critics who are very interested in that play. And I think it's very much about storytelling and about the value of telling things over and about the value of possibly changing those things. It has the sort of shape of the Orpheus story built into it, but it also, by crossing it over with Hades and Persephone, more explicitly changes the inflections, and it has a far more active Eurydice than most versions of that measure. I talk about a couple of other versions of that, those webcomic Lore Olympus, which I think is thinking more about the gender politics of the original myth. And I think lots of cases myths again, Brian, you should probably be answering this question, because this is a lot of what Stories About Stories is about, that fantasy is the place where myths get recontextualized and revivified. I will just say, I am not a person who wants to put walls around fantasy. I would like to draw in. My tendency is always to draw more into it than to try and push things out of it. So that's one of my sort of prejudices. Your mileage may vary. But did you want to pick up on the Stories About Stories approach to myth?
Well, sort of. I'm also thinking about the fact that we seem to have moved into something more like a medieval view of how these stories function, in that our writers, our creators, our game makers, and so on, feel the freedom to play with and alter, so that there's a medieval version of the Orpheus myth that's Sir Orfeo ends with a happy ending. It's a successful rescue from the underworld, or from the fairy kingdom, is the way it's retold, and that kind of freedom and that sense of, well, yes, of course you're going to be retelling an old story, but you're going to make it something new, is back.
Yes, and I think interesting, like, and can change even within particular series. I was thinking, I sort of weirdly had the God of War games come to mind, where they're sort of the first parts of the series are mainly about slaughtering your way through the Greek pantheon, but then they revisit the character they've created as their insert character into the pantheon, and make a second set of games that are in conversation with Norse mythology, but also doing things mainly about being a parent, which is a sort of strange way of taking that. But I think things move. I think when you retell these stories, or use their relatively brief forms that they exist in, they move under your hands, and that's where you find a lot of the interesting ways that they can speak to the present. I think it's also the way it ties into that aspect of fantasy that draws on traditions, draws on tropes, and remakes them. So lots of fantasies use dragons. They're not the same dragons in Anne McCaffrey and in Robin Hobb and in Lucius Shepherd, or in D&D. They do all sorts of weird things when someone else puts their mind into them.
One of the important things that fantasy is doing today, I think, is allowing writers and creators to challenge the myths and the kind of social structures implied in those myths, because we don't have to follow the patterns of, whether it's like the Homeric notion of heroism, or Beowulf and his attitude towards everybody around him, like Grendel and the mother, so that we can take a book like Maria Dahvana Headley's The Mere Wife, and retell that story, so that what was always implied in it is both articulated and challenged.
Yes, and I think that double voicedness. I talk a little bit about the Maria Headley's translation of Beowulf, which I think is in conversation with fantasy, and is also doing lots of the works that fantasy retellings tend to do. So the dragon is gendered differently in that translation, and the sort of the kinds of notions of masculinity which are implicit in the poetry are brought out through this sorts of use of language that some might see as anachronistic, but I think people seeing that as being a bad thing would have Tolkien as a defender, where he talks about Beowulf being a late work where we've lost some of the stuff that came before, but it's nevertheless a deeply sort of careful and playful work, thinking about the way it's telling stories, thinking about what's lost, thinking about what it's going to preserve. So I think there are continuities and changes, but sort of but both of those are important. But there is nothing new under the sun, perhaps, but there is definitely new lights that can be thrown upon things. So yeah, it's a rather than the idea that there is original and unoriginal stuff. Everything is somewhere on a spectrum between the two.
Yeah, sure. Even the stories we think are the myth or the original are just the versions, the one that happened to be recorded, and we're lucky to have them, but they're only one bit of the journey. Right, a question from Theodora Goss, who we all know, and it's lovely to have her here. She's asking, what about fantasy literature written in other languages? It seems as though we focus so much on English language fantasy, and we as English-speaking scholars may have a narrow view of fantasy because of that. We tend not to focus so much on figures like Isabel Allende, Ben Okri, Salman Rushdie, etc. Is that just because we put them in the magical realism basket, which is a term that Okri has criticized, or is it because we just can't access this text, I suppose? I mean, I'm speaking as somebody who is English is not my first language, as you all know, but I operate in an Anglophone sphere as well, so I totally see the point here. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's something. So I deliberately tried to include non-Anglophone fantasy where I could, while also trying to skirt around the problem of cultural appropriation, because fantasy operates slightly differently in different cultures. So I do talk. I talk quite a lot about Borges, who is, of course, a writer deeply in conversation with English language fantasy writing, but is also doing other things. And I think, as he usually is on anything he writes about, is a great commentator on fantasy and the shaping of stories. I talk about sort of various things that sort of fantasy works that originated in Japan, including Final Fantasy VII, FromSoft games, and those sorts of things. I mentioned Ben Okri. I talk very briefly about Isabel Allende, who I would have been interested to talk about more. But so I do think we also, though, need to consider our situatedness. I am terrible in any language other than English, and I cannot necessarily access those texts. So I'm reliant on transmitters. So I think I would frankly acknowledge my limitations there and say, yes, we do need to pay more attention. I'm really looking forward to hopefully the sort of bridges that we can create in fantasy culture to bring more of those stories into English. I'm thinking about the Samovar initiative that Strange Horizons has started recently, which I think is a really brilliant prospect, a sort of a section that is entirely about translated fantasy. And also I hope it's something where the sort of people who are developing as fantasy scholars will be able to bring other sort of fantasy in non-English languages further into prominence, both through translation and through writing critical bridges into those traditions for people who are less familiar with them.
I have the same limitation about what I have access to because I depend on translations. But there is a historical sequence that affects this, and that is that fantasy as a term, as a marketing category, as a culture, emerged in Britain and North America, and then passed to the rest of the world and became a popular form in places like India. But fantasy then retains that association with English language in those places, and writers in those languages are imitating the English language texts. But at the same time, you're starting to get people looking at what are our own sort of autonomous versions of this impulse and how do they differ. So that South Asian writers are looking at earlier texts that can now be called fantasy in retrospect, but were not at the time, were something else. And the same thing in other languages. And there's no single answer to this, because this is a kind of hegemonic move of fantasy imposing itself on the rest of the world. And what we need to do is listen to what the rest of the world has to say back, and get as many opportunities as we can to hear alternative versions of it.
I think I agree with that. But I think that fantasy, if it's going to work usefully as a critical and cultural category, needs to be a place of exchange. So we should be thinking about how wuxia is like the things that get shelved on fantasy in Western bookshelves, about how isekai works, about how, and my examples are going to be mostly China and Japan, because those are the traditions I know as well, about how Katsumi stories move across, but while also respecting that if we're moving those into the frame of fantasy, that's going to make us see them in certain ways, which we should be aware of might not be appropriate to original cultural context. So we should use that interest in these stories in which impossible and wonderful things happen as ways of learning about cultures without necessarily saying, oh, it's exactly like this thing that we do. So that space of fantasy is a space where we can acknowledge difference, I think, is really important.
Great. I'm just conscious we're getting to, it's 20 past, but I'm going to try and do a little bit of creative merging of questions here and see if we can get some of those practical things that actually also are important more widely. So, for example, Mayurika, I hope again I'm pronouncing your name right, is asking Matt about your choice to capitalize the word fantasy, which is clearly is a particular choice. Well, Rebecca is also asking, I suppose that could go to both of you. Are there any fantasy books which you wanted to talk about, but you couldn't for some reason? That fascinates me. The idea of stuff I really wanted to fit in, but I couldn't.
I capitalized fantasy because I wanted to talk about fantasy, small f, as sort of a process, a sort of mental process and other things, particularly in the chapter on language. So capitalizing it was useful when I was talking about mode genre formula, but I wanted to have a sort of obvious shorthand for the reader, which isn't necessarily spelled out, but it is there for when I was referring to that as opposed to the other meanings of fantasy. And the capitalization was the most straightforward way to do that. Just a very short answer to the other question. I really wanted to write about Swords Point, and I just couldn't quite find the way to fit it in. I had this sort of document which I had sort of some initial thoughts on that book and about Alan Kushner, and it kept like sort of not quite fitting into various chapters. So I really regret that, because that's a wonderful book. So that was the thing I couldn't fit in, but it was mainly because of this time pressure on me. It would have fitted in, and the book would have been even longer if I had another month or two.
Yeah, and I would also mention Delia Sherman's The Porcelain Dove, which I think is one of the great fantasy novels and has hardly been touched on. There's so many works you can't talk about, partly because they keep coming out, and the production of fantasy these days is overwhelming, which was not the case when I started working in the field. And along the way, so many people have written really fascinating things that I just never got around to. And for instance, Michael Swanwick, I've never done anything with his fantasies, which I think are really fascinating. And right now I've been working on a conference paper on Native American writers of fantasy. And there are a number of those that have come out in recent years. So it's too new for me to have written about them in any of the books. And I don't know if I will get around to it.
There's far less Pratchett in my book than I expected. And I do still remember it. Particularly, was the most helpful way of saying something I really was finding really difficult to say in chapter 1 in that wonderful soliloquy, that wonderful conversation between Susan and Death about why we need fantasy, which I still think is one of the best sort of crystallizations of that.
Sure.
So another one, Frances Harding, I've never written about.
Great. Okay. We're 25. Okay. I'll try to squeeze one more in, and that's again a practical one. But actually, again, all of us here, as academics, as scholars, as independent scholars, as students, it's a big question. That's from one of our students now. How do you write a book? How do you have any advice on writing a book in itself? Neil Gaiman says Diana has the strategy of sitting down and writing or doing nothing. Do you have a particular technique or advice, especially both of you with full-time jobs most of the time writing a book like this?
Realize it'll take twice as long as you think it should take, and just come to terms with that early on. I don't know. I mean, I can't advise on creative writing so much, although I can point to some of the wonderful books on writing creative fantasy that I refer to in chapter 6. I do think Jeff Vandermeer Wonder Book is a really great book, and I love Jean Wolfe's Grumpy Castle of the Otter, which is named after a misprint for the title of the fourth book of the New Sun book, which is supposed to be Citadel of the Autark. I love that he just picks up this misprint and runs with it. So, I mean, I think advice is to work out what works for you. The way I always talk to PhD students about this is sort of, are you someone who needs to know a lot about the thing you're writing before you write it, or do you think through writing? And I definitely tend towards the latter end of that spectrum. So the way I need to write is I need to have a sense of where I'm going and of what's interesting, but then I just need to put words on the page and then sometimes discard large blocks of them to get to something that's actually worth anyone else reading. Whereas for other people, the writing might be something that happens very near the end of the process of making a book, where actually you spent lots of time revising it, or sort of planning, working up those plans, and the book emerges in that sense. So there's not a right way to write a book, I think, is the question. Like, this book was very different writing my first book.
I think the notion that you're having to write a book, it can be a crippling one. And if instead you think, I'm writing a sentence and then another sentence, and they made a page, and those pages came together and made a chapter, that's how books happen. They don't, for most people, you don't sit down and have the whole book in mind and just write it out.
And that's very good advice for essays, dissertations, the lot. And as I said, there's lots of our students here who will really benefit from this. Great. Okay. 3 minutes to go. I think. How do you feel, you two? Do you think you want to take one more question, or
we can take one more? I don't immediately have to dash off, but
okay. So, oh gosh, where do we go? This is a huge one. There's a question here about going back to, you've talked a lot about myths and sort of the oral tradition and traditional material, but there's a question here by, again, an anonymous attendee who's wondering at what point, even like in classical Greek and Greece and Rome, you would have had potentially the definition of fantasy as stories that included the supernatural that people didn't believe as true, that they were already sort of fictional, thinking about Aesop's fables, Lucian's The True History, which, the title itself is ironic. And then, obviously, Brian mentioned the medieval period before. Does that help us make the claim that fantasy did indeed exist as a recognized form prior to the 18th and 19th centuries?
My short answer is yes, but I think it's important that people didn't call it that in those areas, that it's named romance or a satire or something along those lines. So the cultural context in which it's operating are slightly different. And I think we should include all of those in a long heritage of fantasy, and that we shouldn't think that anyone before a certain point was not capable of recognizing that a story could be fake and still have true meanings. I think this is a conversation that Rob Maslin, who founded the fantasy program at Glasgow, and I often have about whether we should take the beginning of the program back further. Rob looks at a lot of Renaissance fantasies that have this sort of double-layered kind of ironic perspective, and I think you can see that. You can it becomes harder with mythology because you're always imposing your sense of what the audience should be seeing, and it's very hard to draw a distinction there. So I think, again, like the mode genre formula thing, the fantastic mode definitely exists from very early stage in culture. The fact that the bookshop section called fantasy emerges in the 1970s matters, though, I think, and we probably just need a more nuanced history of fantasy. I have a go at sketching it in the third and fourth chapters of the introduction, I guess, but it's very much a sketch. There's a lot more work to do there.
We can also go back to the fuzzy set and say, not is it fantasy, but in what ways is it like fantasy? And that allows me to include somebody like Ovid, who clearly was a skeptic about a lot of what he was writing about and was having fun with it.
Ovid is a good example. We know he made up lots of stuff, but there are some stories that only he has, and we don't know actually they were traditional stories or he made them up. Same with Ossian, of course, and Macpherson. How much of that stuff was collected and how much did he make up? It's always going to be a difficult one. Great. Okay, we've hit the half seven now, so I think this is probably the time to. I don't know whether the webinar will kick us out. Probably not, but we should stick to what we said we would do. Just to say thank you to Matt and Brian. It's been an absolutely brilliant discussion. Lots and lots of comments all the way through, and of course, sorry to everyone whose question we couldn't answer today. Just a couple of last things before I close. Please keep an eye out for more events from the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic. I'll put on the chat just quickly how to keep in touch with us, etc. The big thing that happens every year is, of course, GIFCON, and we've announced dates 15th to the 17th of May, and so keep an eye out for more information on that in the CFP to come. There's a Tolkien and 21st Century Religion in November in collaboration with the Tolkien Society. And there's more to come that I can't quite talk about yet. So keep an eye out on our website and social media, etc. But please join me in thanking Brian and Matt one more time. And congratulations, both of you, on books and awards and this great discussion. Thank you.
It's finished a thing. This is always a nice
You're done. Absolutely. Great.
Thank you all as well.
Thank you all.